Gaius Scribonius Curio, Tribune of the Plebs, 50 BCE. The son of a Sullan consul, Curio the Younger had a strong independent streak, which led to considerable friction with his father and with many of his fellow senators. Often considered typical of his fast-living and cynical generation, Curio was a man of considerable intelligence and ability. Dutifully, Curio adhered to his father's politics, which were far more flexible than one might expect from an aging Sullan stalwart. Even before he held a single office, and while he was still living with his father, the younger Curio was a player in Roman politics, with his mentor Cicero speculating that Lucius Vettius's seditious activities were aimed primarily at ruining the young man's career before it began. Curio would enter office during the age of the First Triumvirate, an alliance he despised with every fiber of his being. When he returned to Rome in 52 BCE, Curio found that his father was on the verge of death and his friend Clodius had been assassinated. Wasting neither time nor the opportunity, Curio threw magnificent funeral games for his father and married Clodius's widow Fulvia. He now began to chart an independent course in Roman politics, attaining the office of tribune, proposing a broad raft of legislation, and making it clear that he opposed the extreme concentration of power in individuals such as Caesar and Pompey. As politics polarized between Caesar and Pompey, Curio shocked the world by proposing a compromise between the two potentates. His proposal won overwhelming support in the Senate, but the Pompeian war party made sure that it did not come to pass. Curio went with his friends Antony and Caelius to join Caesar, which has led to much speculation about what might have led to this stunning turn of events. I will argue that Curio went over to Caesar because he regarded him as the more palpable of the two options, and had come to see Pompey as the greater danger to republican liberty. Caesar, ever generous, gave Curio pro-praetorian rank and tasked him with securing Sicily and Africa. Whatever his political leanings, Curio went forward with his characteristic energy, quickly driving Cato the Younger from southern Italy and Sicily. Pushing on to Africa, Curio wanted to quickly secure this breadbasket and humble the proud Numidians, whose independence he had previously advocated bringing to an end. Despite invading with only 2 legions, with some of those men being of dubious loyalty, and 500 cavalry, Curio won brilliant early successes around Utica. Rather than awaiting the arrival of his other 2 legions, Curio decided instead to launch a spoiler attack on King Juba's general, only to find out that his scouting was poor, and that he was now facing the whole mobile Numidian army, in the open field no less. Curio and most of his men took a trip down the river Styx, and this was the only major defeat that Caesar would suffer in 49. It also would allow the Pompeians to field another army in Africa a few years later, leading to the Thapsus campaign. Although Curio made serious mistakes, I will argue that Curio clearly possessed military talent, and could have become an excellent commander if he had had more time to acquire seasoning. Let us now dive into controversy itself, and explore the life and politics and campaign of a man who was famously skilled at concealing his intentions, even from his friends. At the time of Curio the Younger's birth in 84 BCE or thereabouts, his family had not yet attained the highest offices of the Senate. His family wasn't exactly new, as their Senate membership dated back as far as the Second Punic War, but up to this point no member of gens Scribonia had attained a senior magistracy. The most famous branch of the family in the past had been the Libones, but they had fallen off pretty hard by the mid-2nd century. Later on, when Augustus made an effort to revitalize the old families of Rome, they would make a comeback and a couple of them would become consuls. But during the time of the younger Curio, it was only his branch, the Curiones, which had any real pull. The person who got the Curiones over the hump was none other than Gaius Scribonius Curio the Elder, the father of Curio the Younger, who became consul in 76 BCE. His nickname was Burbulaeus because he tended to move his body around while he was speaking. This was reminiscent of a famous actor at the time. It also is an indication that he was a practitioner of what was known as the Asiatic school of oratory, which was oratory with a great number of gestures and some emotion. Despite having a somewhat exotic oratorical style, though, the elder Curio was a staunch Sullan conservative. Not only did he uphold the Sullan order as consul, and then in the years after that, but he also, during the Civil War period, fought by Sulla's side as a legate from 87, when Sulla first went to fight Mithridates, all the way until 81, when Sulla emerged victorious in the Civil War with the Marians. So, the elder Curio was very well respected within the ranks of the Senate, and he had a number of connections that would be very helpful for his son. Unlike a lot of father-son relationships, we actually know a great deal about the relationship between the two Curiones. As for Curio's mother, we only know a little bit. Her name was Memia. Her father was a minor senator, Lucius Memmius. In fact, as a moneyer, he might not actually have even made it into the Senate. But given that his brother, as we'll see, was a candidate for consul, most likely Lucius Memmius did have a somewhat respectable career in the Senate. Cicero tells us that Lucius Memmius was someone who was an aggressive but mediocre orator, and Cicero, as someone who studied oratory very intently, attended a lot of Senate meetings and court cases as a teenager, so he heard Lucius Memmius speak. Probably the most famous member of Curio's family, though, was his great-uncle, Gaius Memmius Mordax. He had been a consular candidate in 100, and he was in a pretty good position to win, but then he had been murdered by Saturninus, the famous tribune. Saturninus and Gaius Marius had been close allies, but then the Senate passed the final decree and gave the consul Marius authority to go murder Saturninus, which is exactly what he did. And that was one of the most famous incidents in recent history. So the fact that the murder of Curio's great-uncle started all that would have meant that this would be the kind of story that his mother would have really raised him on. Of course, all of that would have been eclipsed by the fact that his father did finally reach the consulship when he was 8 years old, but still one imagines that if you were to ask Curio about Roman history, he would have a very strong interest in the events of 100, much more so than most men of his generation, since it was very much his family's story. The younger Curio was highly charismatic and was able to cultivate a wide circle of friends. A number of modern scholars have said that the size of his friend circle and the varying politics of the people in it is proof of both the complexity of Curio's politics and also his political skill, in that he could take the stances he took while still enjoying the friendship of so many varied individuals. However, we have to understand that Roman politics is a little more complicated than simple factions. The factions are useful shorthands, but ultimately they're not necessarily a full-blown explanation or understanding of how things worked. Curio's mentor, or at least one of them, was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the consul of 63, a famous orator, and someone who enjoyed a close friendship with both the elder and younger Curio. So most of what we know about Curio, at least a great deal, comes to us from Cicero. Of course, Cicero was not quite of the same generation as Curio, and so one imagines that sometimes Curio told him what he wanted to hear, and Cicero tended to see him as kind of a nephew of sorts. So he tended to both perhaps think of Curio as being a little bit more naive than he was, while also being very disappointed in Curio at times, which we'll get into. Perhaps Curio's best friend, if any one of these individuals would attain that title, would be Mark Antony. Mark Antony, of course, famously later became a triumvir and is now one of the great names in Roman history, but during Curio's lifetime, Antony was certainly considered to be inferior to him in every way. They were the same age, and they were best friends. We'll see that most of the elder Curio's hatred of Antony was due to Antony's spending habits and excessive drinking, But Cicero, who helped to reconcile the two, would have a different version of the story when he was contesting with Antony around 43. And that version of the story is that the elder Curio did not want his son to be in a homosexual relationship with Antony. Most likely that story is simple fiction just designed to smear Antony. And again, by that point, Curio had been dead for several years, so Cicero was not afraid of offending his friend. Another associate of Curio, a man who was several years his elder, was Publius Clodius Pulcher, the famous Tribune of 58 and Aedile of 56, who led a gang. What's interesting about that relationship is that Clodius was also a close ally of the elder Curio, who, as I said, was a Sullan stalwart. And so what this shows is that although we think of Clodius as being a popularis par excellence, in fact, he was not necessarily understood that way by a number of his contemporaries. They saw him as someone who was a loose cannon and potentially an opponent to men like Pompey and Caesar, and so a number of rather conservative senators actually promoted him. What's also interesting, too, is that although both of the Curiones were strong proponents and defenders of Clodius at various times, they also opposed him on the issue of exiling Cicero. So sometimes that relationship was probably a little rocky, but for the most part it appears that Curio and Clodius were on pretty good terms on most days. Another close friend of Curio was Marcus Caelius Rufus, who became praetor in 48, and was a little bit younger than Curio. They also were close enough that Cicero, when he was wondering what Curio was up to or what he was thinking, wrote to Caelius to enlighten him. And so we actually know a lot about Curio's political thinking from Caelius. We'll take a look at what Caelius had to say later. Suffice it to say now, though, that Cicero and Caelius, when they wrote letters back and forth, tended to engage in a lot of sarcasm. And so we have to kind of read between the lines a bit to try to get at what the real thoughts of Curio might have been. One thing to keep in mind is that the elder Curio was cool with Clodius, liked Cicero a lot, but really hated Mark Antony for reasons we'll get into in a minute. As far as his feelings about Caelius, we don't know. We first see the Curiones interact with Clodius in the year 62, when Clodius did something that made him the talk of the town in an almost entirely negative way. Some people say there's no such thing as bad press, but that only is the case if you survive that bad press, which Clodius nearly didn't. At the time, Clodius still had not been adopted as a plebeian, so he was still Publius Claudius Pulcher. He decided to dress up and attend a festival for women, the Bona Dea festival, or Good Goddess celebration. This was being held at the house of the Pontifex Maximus, Gaius Julius Caesar, elected just the year before, and supposedly the reason given for Clodius's attendance was not any kind of impiety or even curiosity about what the good goddess might be up to, but rather a simple boneheaded decision to try to get in a quickie with Caesar's wife Pompeia. Now, whether this was true or not was never really fully established. One would think that if Clodius endangered the state this way, because remember the Romans believed that much of their success owed to the favor of the gods, that any of the Sullan stalwarts would be eager to purge this man from the state as a cancer. But, in fact, the elder Curio was a staunch supporter of Clodius and was one of his defenders, one of his most vocal defenders. And since he was an ex-consul, that was a pretty good ally to have around. In the end, the elder Curio and the younger Curio, along with their various allies, were successful, and after a 2-year period, Clodius was at length acquitted. Now, possibly it's simply because the penalty seemed out of proportion with the offense. Perhaps also, at least if Cicero is to be believed, it was due to bribery. This is also one instance where Cicero and the Curiones were not on the same page. Cicero always hated Clodius from this moment forward, and that things would get far worse as we entered the next decade. It's also possible that the people in the Senate wanted to get rid of Clodius at this time, but then, as the affair just dragged on, they lost interest and ultimately decided to just let him go. We'll never really know. But what we do see come out of this is that while Clodius was clearly doing some dangerous things, he still had a lot of defenders in high places. And that should come as no real surprise given that his family was perhaps the most patrician of patrician clans to ever exist. The year 59 was not a good one for either of the two Curiones. First, they got the disturbing news heading into the new year that Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had formed a political alliance, a triumvirate, if you will, and that they were now dominating Roman politics. So much power in the hands of so few was against the norms of the Senate and threatened to undermine the Republic, which had done so much to help families like the Curiones. There were also problems closer to hand and of a more personal nature. 59 was a year where Curio would nearly lose his relationship with his father. And it was all over money. Curio was best friends with Antony. They had been friends as teenagers, and now that they were entering their 20s, they were just as close as ever. The elder Curio had never particularly cared for Antony because he thought that the boy was frivolous, maybe a bit stupid, and certainly reckless. But what really drove the elder Curio to fury was when he learned that Antony had roped in his son into his lifestyle of excessive spending and partying. So while he might have been willing to tolerate some level of goofing off from Curio, he was not willing to allow his son to fund Antony's exorbitant lifestyle. In fact, at some point, Antony was able to persuade his best friend to stand as surety for the 6 million sesterces he owed. And when we say stand as surety, this does not mean that young Curio was putting his own resources on the line. It meant that he was putting his father's resources on the line, since he was still a dependent and could only have money by means of getting it through his father. So the elder Curio was now on the hook for debts accumulated by a young man he despised. And when he found out that his son had made this pledge, he thought that his son had really screwed up, and he was doubting his son's judgment, to say the least. He actually was thinking about disowning his son over this because it was that serious, and 6 million sesterces probably would not have broken the family, but it definitely would have put a big dent in their finances. By this point, Cicero had become a mutual friend of both of the Curiones, and they actually had bonded fairly recently over their mutual disgust over the formation of the triumvirate. And so Cicero stepped in and offered to mediate between father and son. So he talked to them about the situation, and he helped them hammer out a compromise deal where they could reconcile. And for Curio, this would have been important, not just because of his emotional closeness to his dad, but also because that was where his wealth was ultimately going to derive from inheritance. So if he were to be disowned, he would be totally screwed. The understanding was that the elder Curio would honor his son's commitments, so he actually did pay a lot of this debt, but Curio would no longer be allowed to associate with Antony, so their friendship would end, at least officially. So this led to an uneasy peace between the two men who continued to live together, but one imagines that the tension remained for quite a while, because this was a major screw-up by the younger Curio, and it meant also that his father was taking on quite a bit of debt that he did not want. Also, most likely the younger Curio did not actually adhere to the part of the agreement where he ceased being friends with Antony. I'm sure there was a cooling off, and perhaps he even felt like Antony had betrayed him in a way, because Antony most likely had given him assurances that it wouldn't be that bad. At any rate, though, later on the story was told by Cicero in a highly distorted form in the Second Philippic, where he claims that the real reason why the elder Curio was so angry is that he found that the two young men were lovers. But I think that is a clear case of distortion and just trying to smear Antony by any means possible. The real story was one of simple debt and a young man going way too far to help a friend. One imagines that the Curio household was still rather uncomfortable. Within a few months, another major crisis would come to the doorstep of father and son. A few months later in 59, Lucius Vettius, a well-known political informant, approached the elder Curio in public and asked him something that made his hair stand on end. He asked him to join a plot to assassinate Pompey. The hatred the elder Curio felt for Pompey was no secret, and yet he did not want to be party to something that would most likely fail and result in him being exiled or worse. And so the elder Curio, who I believe was informed at this time by Vettius that his son was already on board, most likely had a very heated discussion at home, and whatever the results of that conversation might have been, the elder Curio decided that he was going to spill the beans and report Vettius in case this was some sort of elaborate setup. And so Curio, the elder, went to the Senate and laid all this out. That led to the arrest of Vettius by the consul Caesar and one of his chief lieutenants, Publius Vatinius. Vettius was being held in the public jail cell at the Forum, and he was being questioned. There were 2 hearings where he threw out a number of names. At the first hearing, he was throwing out a seeming random assortment of names, where there were some major figures who were named. I believe Crassus might have been among them. But he also threw out the names of rising stars in Roman politics, men who actually weren't in the Senate yet, but clearly would be soon. So we're talking about guys in their late 20s, such as Marcus Junius Brutus and Curio the Younger. At the second meeting, Vettius then threw out the names Bibulus, Cicero, and Lucullus, all of whom were on less than great terms with Caesar, which has led to a lot of speculation that Caesar started to really bend Vettius's ear and tell him that if he wanted to survive, he needed to say certain names. That same night that Vettius denounced Bibulus, Cicero, and Lucullus, he then died under mysterious circumstances. And then the affair was swept under the rug. Caesar and others said, well, I guess there's nothing to see here after all. Sorry for bringing the whole city's attention to this matter. Cicero had a theory about who was the real target of all this, and one would think that given Cicero's usual self-obsession, he would have said that he was the true target, but no. He actually thinks that the real main target was the younger Curio, that the enemies of perhaps the father and the son wanted to take out the younger Curio preemptively. And exactly why this would make sense, I'm not entirely sure. Cicero does not explain this terribly well. Nonetheless, he thinks that Curio was the target. So this means that although he had not yet held an office, people did have some regard for Curio and thought that he was going to rise to the top of Roman politics. One of the reasons why he might have been a target, now that I think about it, is because the young Curio was a very outspoken critic of the triumvirate, especially Caesar, who of course was the guy running the investigation into Lucius Vettius. The 50s was almost certainly the most raucous decade of Roman politics, and it was in this rough and tumble environment when Curio was finally admitted to the Senate. In the summer of 56, he won an election and became quaestor. He was about 28 or 29 at the time, and the following year, in 55, he set out to assume his duties. He would serve as quaestor in Roman Asia, which was one of the richest provinces in the whole republic, and he would stay there in total for about 3 years. It appears that his duties ended at the end of 53. Lummus Lagi, who is a modern expert on Curio, believes that Curio followed the by now time-honored tradition of lining his pockets. Many Romans came to Asia with one level of wealth and left with a much higher level of wealth. And we see that there is some evidence that Curio had more money than before when he gets back to Rome. When he did return in early 52, Curio found that Rome had changed quite a bit in his absence. One event that had occurred right before his return was the murder of his old friend Clodius. something we'll circle back to in a minute. In the meantime, while he was trying to take advantage of that, Curio also had a little bit of a personal tragedy going on at home, as his father was growing ever older and more frail. Finally, in 51, his father gave up the ghost. And despite the fact that his father had been famously austere, Curio decided that his father deserved magnificent funeral games. Perhaps he was thinking that because his father was so old, that his consulship a quarter century earlier had been largely forgotten. So what better way to remind people of the name Scribonius Curio than by putting on a show that people would talk about for years? And for years indeed, they did talk about what Curio did, because Curio would prove to be perhaps the greatest innovator of funeral celebrations. He, or more precisely the person he hired who had a genius for architecture, created a highly innovative wooden stage. And this stage was capable of either forming a back-to-back amphitheater on either side with two different shows going on, so you could have actors on one side and an animal fight on the other, or the two could then merge into sort of a mini wooden coliseum. So this was a very cool, advanced contraption, and even a century later, Pliny the Elder in his Natural History talked about it in detail, because it was something that was mechanically very sophisticated. One modern author has proposed that this was the first permanent amphitheater in Rome, but given that it was made out of wood, I don't know how long this thing would have lasted or still been able to transform between the two forms at will. So I'm not sure how well maintained this thing was, but nonetheless it did succeed in getting a great deal of attention for Curio. And by this point, as we'll see, he had people he was trying to entertain, because he was vying to be a political heir to none other than Clodius. In fact, he was so magnificent in his performance of his father's funeral that he bought too many animals. And so the next year he simply gave them to his friend Caelius. So Curio was going all in, and it appears that he was having quite a bit of success at attracting support. But how else was he vying for the mantle of Clodius and leadership of the gang? Clodius's death not only left his gang without a leader, but also his widow without a husband. Fulvia was still young, she was incredibly wealthy, and unlike most Roman women, she was not only incredibly politically astute, but was willing to appear in public and speak to crowds. The crowd who followed Clodius had quite fallen in love with her, and Fulvia was not afraid to use that power. For someone as ambitious as Curio, she was a great match. She also not only was still young, but was fertile. She had recently given birth to the younger Publius Clodius Pulcher, and so he knew that she could be the mother of his children. All in all, this was a perfect match for Curio, and he pursued her and won her hand. This sent shockwaves through the streets of Rome, because by this time Milo was in exile, so there was no real heir for the conservative gang, whereas now there was a very strong heir who was taking over Clodius's coalition. It appears, though, that Curio did not really have any intention of fighting street battles. He just wanted the votes, and it looks like he was able to get those votes. He also was just about at the point where he could run for Tribune, and that would enable him to use the office that had made Clodius such a major player in Roman politics. So Curio was now in a great position with a lot of support from different directions. He had always been deeply opposed to Caesar especially, but the First Triumvirate in general, since its inception. And this also meant that for Pompey, Caesar, and, well, Crassus was dead by now, but so Pompey and Caesar, that they were a little bit worried about what Curio might be up to. So Curio was now someone people were talking about. He was one of the it men in Rome, despite the fact that he had only held one office, and it was the most junior office. During the course of their marriage, which would last for a couple of years, Fulvia would give birth to a son, also named Gaius Scribonius Curio. Of course, the son would live well beyond when his father dies in 49. He would grow up, and he would ultimately side with Antony, who coincidentally was Fulvia's third husband, and then he would die after Octavian captured and killed him at Actium. Of course, Fulvia would play a major role in Antony's time as a triumvir, and one of the people I actually want to cover going forward is Fulvia. She's one of the most important Roman women of the Republic, but this is all we need to talk about for now in regard to her. At a time when everyone was wondering what young Curio would do next, one of the people who got asked that the most was Cicero, who was his mentor. Unfortunately for Cicero, he found himself out of the loop at the moment because he was off in Cilicia working as a proconsular governor, much to his chagrin. Cicero himself, not able to ask Curio what he was up to, relied upon Marcus Caelius Rufus to stay informed. And Rufus actually wrote a surviving long letter to Cicero going through all of the political goings-on in Rome, including what Curio was up to. Caelius tells us that Curio was able to get elected to the office of tribune because one of the 10 men elected in the summer of 51 had been condemned about a month after his election. So Servius went down, Curio ran in the special election and won. So Curio will now be a tribune in the year 50. Caelius tells Cicero, who apparently worried about what Curio might do, that indeed Curio would remain loyal to the soil, and that he would remain a staunch enemy of Caesar and a friend to the best men, the Optimates. However, he said that in the ranks of the Senate at this time, there was still a lot of doubt about Curio and his intentions, because a lot of people didn't simply understand that he was an easygoing guy. And they also just weren't accustomed to the fact that he really didn't follow a fixed plan and played things loosely. I assume a lot of that is sarcastic, because clearly, while we don't know whether Curio was easygoing or not, we do know that he clearly did a lot of planning. As we'll see, he not only had an extraordinarily detailed agenda for legislation, but he also had a very thoughtful and methodical approach to how to deal with the crisis between Pompey and Caesar and how to avert war. So clearly Caelius is being a bit ironic here, and in fact Curio was extraordinarily thoughtful and had a very ambitious program as tribune. So far as Gaius Scribonius Curio was concerned, the year 50 would be his year. Nothing would interrupt his legislative agenda. While he was not going to go as far as some tribunes of the past had done, and he didn't want to really buck the Senate too hard, he did think that with his reputation for being a level-headed individual, combined with his power base, that he would be able to pull off some reforms that would make the Republic a better place. And it's quite clear that he intended to reform a little bit of everything. So perhaps he was naive, or perhaps he simply thought that he should go all in on reform and see what he could get. We're not entirely sure what he was thinking, but we do know that he was thinking rather hard about all of this. One thing that he did not anticipate, and to be fair, no one else did either, is that midway through the year, all of the conversation would be hijacked by the looming war between Caesar and Pompey. What would happen that summer is that the elections for the consuls of 49 would return two men who were adamant opponents of Caesar and wanted to see him fight with Pompey. But for the first half of the year, Curio was very much busying himself with trying to get a very extensive slate of legislation passed. In both the Senate and perhaps at a contio or two, which is a public meeting, Curio was making proposals for all kinds of different things. Now, most likely, he would not have been willing to go to the People's Assembly to get things passed, which is what a normal radical tribune would do, but rather because he had this family history of opposing such things, he wanted to work with the Senate, but perhaps give them the threat that if they obstruct him, he will go around them, which is a threat that I don't know if he made it, but if he did make it, he never fulfilled it so far as we know. Anyway, he had proposals about grain distribution. He wanted to have a more generous grain dole. He wanted land reform, which was something that the Romans kept putting off. He wanted road construction. He wanted the provinces to be reassigned, or at least to be rethought about how provinces were distributed. So he wanted to do a major reform in that regard. We don't know exactly what he had in mind, by the way. He also wanted to recall an exile named Memmius, who was presumably a relative on his mother's side. He also wanted to annex the kingdom of Numidia, so that will become important later when he goes to Africa as a pro-Praetorian commander. He wants to tax the number of slaves taken on a journey. So if a senator travels in great style with a massive household, he wanted them to pay a tax on it. And he also had all kinds of other measures that Cassius Dio simply called strange measures. We don't really know exactly what they were or whether they were truly strange, but certainly Curio was someone who had a whole lot of ideas and was trying to put them all out there to get them made into law. In order to get all this done and to explain all of his thinking, which apparently was relatively new and a bit out of the mainstream, one thing he wanted to do was to add an intercalary month to the year 50. So that would effectively make the year 50 a month longer, which would give him more time to win votes for his ideas and to convince people that this was the way forward. However, the Pontifical College refused to cooperate, and this month wasn't added. We also hear in later accounts that apparently this was what really pissed him off. And actually there's a whole article by a previous scholar who says that it was that insult which drove him to side with Caesar ultimately. But we don't really know. It's also possible, again, given that a lot of these guys like to be ironic, that somebody asked him what drove him out of one camp and in the Caesars, and he said this as kind of a joke. But again, suffice it to say that he was not getting cooperation, and he also was not really willing to use his leverage, but at the same time, the man clearly has ideas. So he was not exactly the best reformer. But what's also interesting is that if we look at the scope of these reforms, and also how some of them are fairly technocratic, I guess we could call it for lack of a better term, it's kind of similar to what Caesar will do as dictator. And so one imagines that perhaps one of the things that ultimately brought them together is that when they started talking, they realized that both of them had a lot of ideas about different tweaks that could be made to the Republic. So why was Curio so curiously ineffective as a reformer? Well, I believe that he was a victim of his upbringing. His father was a sullen conservative who clearly did not believe in the power of the tribunate. And while Curio was of a different generation and understood that stripping the tribunes of power had not solved Rome's problems, still he was his father's son, and he would have been raised with those values. It appears for the most part that his politics were not that radically different from his father's. So he did not want to see tribunes going around passing laws without the Senate's approval. He was very much into the idea that the Senate should be consensual, and that the body as a whole should work together as a ruling elite. So he was not really willing to buck that institution too much. He also knew that there were some anti-reform members of that body who were the kinds of guys who would get aroused by the idea of calling for the final decree or of painting him as a radical. And he did not want to be a radical. Curio wanted to be respected. Curio wanted to be someone who was mainstream. If he was going to be a reformer, he wanted to be more of a reformer like a Scipio Aemilianus rather than like a Tiberius Gracchus. And so he was only willing to go so far. The other thing to keep in mind is that he too shared the fears that a lot of his colleagues might have had about radical tribunes. Remember, he had lost his great uncle to the radical tribune Saturninus. And so Curio was only willing to go but so far. And knowing that, his colleagues were able to just ignore him. The other problem, though, is that the year got hijacked by the looming political crisis. So midway through, as I mentioned, there was an election in the summer. 2 new consuls were elected who stated upon election that they were going to effectively force Caesar to lay down his arms and face trial. Most other people in Rome knew that that would mean war. And so as the summer dragged into fall and dragged into winter, it became increasingly all that people could talk about what would happen in 49. Would the Senate issue an ultimatum to Caesar, and how would he react? Well, Curio decided at some point, I'm not going to worry about these other issues, all of which pale in significance to the potential for another civil war. Instead, I'm going to try to be a peacemaker. I don't think any of these people are behaving rationally, and I want to come up with an equitable solution to this problem. And so Curio would devote his considerable energy and intellect to trying to figure out, what do we do to avoid a war? To summarize the positions that each side had, the Senate, at least the war party in the Senate, believed that Caesar needed to lay down his command, come back to Rome, and face trial. They were pretty confident that he would be convicted for the crimes he committed as consul in 59, and that would lead to his condemnation and the end of his career. On the other hand, Caesar demanded that he be allowed to run for consul in absentia and immediately enter a second term as consul before then getting a new command against Parthia to avenge Crassus. So effectively, one side wanted Caesar to face certain condemnation, and Caesar himself wanted to avoid all accountability whatsoever. These were two mutually incompatible positions. And over time, these positions would harden, not only to the degree to which they were felt, but also Caesar would become more and more adamant about being allowed to run in absentia, which at first was more tentative. Then with the Senate side, or at least the Lentulus Crus Metellus Scipio side of things, they became more and more adamant about Caesar having to lay aside everything and be cleared in court before he was allowed to do anything else. So these positions got farther and farther apart as the summer of 50 moved forward into the winter and then the early winter of 49. So Curio decided that he needed to find a middle ground here, a reasonable position. And his position was one which was very much in line with the norms of the Roman Republic. In the Republic, each senator was supposed to be approximately equal, but at this time there were two men who towered above all the rest. Pompey and Caesar both had extraordinary commands. Both of them had extraordinary auctoritas. They had a large number of veterans who were more loyal to them than to the Republic. And so his proposal is, all right, if we're going to call out Caesar for his irregularities, then in all fairness, we should not be backing Pompey in this way. We need to call for both of them to disarm. Both of them need to get rid of their extraordinary offices. Pompey should not be governing Spain from Rome. That's crazy. So both of them need to give up these extraordinary commands, and neither should have troops. Then Caesar can come back to Rome and face trial. He should not have to unilaterally disarm. He's correct that allowing Pompey to have these privileges whereas he doesn't is unfair. And so he appealed to the idea of a kind of egalitarianism among the oligarchs. And this would prove to be pretty popular, as we'll see. However, because the times had become so charged in a partisan sense, Lentulus Crus and the other Optimates said that Curio had been bribed by Caesar, clearly, and that he was simply trying to smear Pompey, that he was being unreasonable and was missing the point of all this. So Curio was being attacked for his efforts, although again we'll see that a pretty good majority of the Senate was behind him. The other consul, Gaius Marcellus, was a little bit less harsh to Curio, but still was in favor of going to war with Caesar, and he called for a vote to condemn Caesar when he crossed the Alps. However, Curio, who was still tribune, was able to veto that measure. And remember, the Alps were not the provincial boundary. Cisalpine Gaul, which was part of Caesar's province, was in Italy. At least part of it was. So the Alps were a part of his province. He had not gone to war with the Senate. So Curio was correct here, but for the war party, this was something that for them was another sign that Curio was being partial to Caesar. So remember, a lot of this idea that Curio was being too kind to Caesar was because the people making the accusations were absolutely thirsting for Caesar's blood. What Curio didn't know, if there was something that he was missing here, is that at this point, Pompey too hated Caesar, and Pompey was very much backing his father-in-law, Metellus Scipio, and the consul Lentulus Crus to keep pushing for more and more radical demands on Caesar. By this point, the reconciliation between Caesar and Pompey, while technically still possible, was as wildly unlikely as a reconciliation between Jim Cornette and Vince Russo. On December 1st of the year 50, Curio's proposal was put before the Senate for a vote. His proposal, by way of reminder, was that both Pompey and Caesar would lay down their offices and arms together, and then Caesar would face trial. This carried the Senate by a narrow margin of 374 and 22 against. So Curio had found the winning formula here. He had found what would make the vast majority of the Senate happy, what they all agreed was fair and right, and what would also serve his long-term agenda, shared by a whole lot of people in Rome, of preventing great men from upsetting the balance of power within the Senate. So Curio had really struck a chord here, but unfortunately for him, there were those 22 obstructionists who decided that war it must be, because they could not abide in a world where Caesar got off so easy. They wanted to make sure that the deck was stacked and that Caesar was prosecuted. Perhaps for some reason they thought Caesar, who had a large, active, experienced, and loyal army, wouldn't use it in a war. I don't know exactly what they were thinking, but they weren't thinking quite as much as Curio was about this. Although this vote was overwhelming in favor of Curio's proposal, it still didn't become law due to obstruction. Most likely one of the other tribunes imposed a veto at the behest of someone like Lentulus Crus, who was the consul-elect, or the sitting consul Marcellus, or the other consul-elect Marcellus, who was the cousin of the aforementioned, or at the behest of Metellus Scipio, the father-in-law of Pompey, or on orders from Pompey writing from the suburbs. So at any rate, this did not end up becoming law. Caesar, although he was upset that this bill would not allow him to run for consul in absentia, still recognized that this was preferable to war. And so he endorsed the bill a little bit later, and he said, let's go back to that bill that Curio put forward. While I'm not comfortable with the idea of not being allowed to run in absentia, which I think is unfair, I think this bill is the best path forward we can get, so let's go back to that. But the bill was never put forward for a vote again, because, again, obstructionists were now running the Senate. In fact, on December 10th, Curio left office as a tribune, and with it he lost something very important, his sacrosanct status. A tribune in office cannot be physically harmed without it being an offense to the gods. A little bit later, when Lentulus Crus became consul, he made it very plain that he was horny for war, and that anyone who stood in his way, especially Curio, needed to leave, because if they didn't, he would declare them to be public enemies and have them put to death. Which, by the way, would be quite unprecedented just for simply advocating for a negotiated settlement. So Curio and his friends decided that their only real path forward was to leave, and it was at this point that he decided to declare his allegiance to Caesar. Which of course leads us to the great controversy of Curio's life. Why did he join Caesar, and what were his motives? The politics of the early empire were rather dull, and so accordingly, when they wanted to get their political fix, a lot of the senators of that era would look back to the late Republic, where their grandfathers had contended so viciously and with so much cunning. Accordingly, all of the major political actions of the Civil War era were analyzed to death, and the consensus that emerged in the imperial tradition was that Curio had been bribed by Caesar, that he had turned to Caesar for gold, not out of any kind of principle, and not because he was pursuing any kind of agenda of his own. So Curio, in the end, according to the imperial tradition, was simply a minor functionary who danced for coin. However, this narrative relies upon the assumption that Curio was broke, and also that this was his motivation. Again, remember, we have contemporary sources, including sources written by people who were quite close to Curio. And when we look at the records that we have from Cicero, for instance, we see no instance of Curio being broke or of ever asking Caesar for money. And this is from a man in Cicero who was quite disappointed in the fact that Curio decided to go with Caesar and also convinced Caelius to go with him. So if there were any truth whatsoever to the idea that Curio was just in it for money and wanted to get Caesar's gold, then Cicero most likely would have written about it with some bitterness. But he doesn't. And speaking of Curio's financial affairs, so far as we know, he was fairly secure. He had at least 2 villas, probably more, but these 2 were in very nice places, Alba and Cumae, so one of them at least is Campanian, which is primo real estate. And also Fulvia came with a considerable dowry. She was quite wealthy, and she also was, in many ways, the heiress of at least part of the Claudian family. So all of this meant that Curio should be flush with cash, or at the bare minimum, quite comfortable, even if he was still paying off some of the expenditure that he had made for his father's funeral. So what's the most likely explanation? Well, I don't agree with the one scholar who talked about Curio being pissed off about the calendar. Rather, I think it's much simpler than that. Curio had come into the year 50 with an ambitious agenda for reform that had been scuttled, and he looked at Caesar as someone who was somewhat open to reform. So there's that part of it. So he started to change his opinion of Caesar a bit. Perhaps as they talked, Caesar convinced him that the Vettius affair had not been aimed at him, or else confessed, yes, it was aimed at you, but I've changed my mind about you in the years since. So perhaps they aired out some dirty laundry that made them able to get along better. Then, during the crisis itself, he saw that while Caesar could be stubborn and could be unreasonable on certain things, that at the end of the day he was more flexible and willing to bend and listen to reason than Pompey. So up to this point, as far as Curio was concerned, Caesar was the devil of Roman politics. He had hated Caesar with a burning passion, at least since 59, if not earlier. But now, he looked at Caesar as the lesser of the 2 evils. Pompey was the one who ultimately pressed for not accepting the compromise. Caesar would have taken the deal. Pompey did not want it. So perhaps he felt like the faction that he had fought for in the streets and in the Senate his whole life had failed him. They had betrayed him. He had come up with a way to avoid catastrophe, and they had scuttled it. Also, we can think about what Caelius said when he was explaining his own decision to go with Curio and Antony. Caelius told Cicero that if you look at the 2 sides, Caesar has the advantage because he's got more troops. I want to be on the winning side. So perhaps it's as simple as, out of disgust, Curio decided that he would rather see Caesar win than see a bunch of fools lose. We don't really know, but all of these factors could be at play. And we do know that he was very, very bitter about the way that things had gone, because later on when Cicero will talk about how he's still hopeful for a peace settlement even as the war in Italy is starting, Curio will laugh and mock such ideas, saying that it's too late. And perhaps that's just ego. Maybe he thinks he was the only person who could stop the war. But once he decides to go in for the war, Curio goes all in. Whatever his motives may have been, whether Curio was simply bribed or whether his motives were far more complex, he did end up riding into Caesar's camp with his friends Antony and Caelius and pledging his allegiance to Caesar's cause. So this would have probably been one of the most awkward meetings in the history of the Republic. Caesar and Curio, by all accounts, despised each other and had for many years. Curio had been talking trash about Caesar for a decade or more, and Caesar had probably struck back at some point. Yet now they found themselves allies, and Curio fought down the bile and pledged his loyalty to Caesar. Mark Antony, who had considerable social skills, would have really been tested this day to try to make things pleasant and to make sure that the two men were able to really go forward with this agreement. So Mark Antony, this was probably one of the greatest trials of his life, and it would have been a damn awkward time. But they got through it, and Curio would eventually become a stalwart of the Caesarian cause, at least for the short duration he had left on this earth. Now, whether his adherence to Caesar was more about self-interest, or whether it was more simply about advancing his own reputation, we can't really say. What is clear is that Curio's opinion about Caesar most likely didn't change in any substantial way. He still thought that Caesar was an existential threat to the Republic and that he was a piece of shit. And most likely, Caesar didn't really feel that much more kindly about Curio. One piece of evidence we have is that after Curio dies in 49, his friend Caelius will lament his own decision to join Caesar. So Curio had been the one who actually convinced Caelius to come along. He probably argued that Caesar was the lesser of two evils and most likely to win. Caelius saw Caesar as more likely to win, but as the greater of the two evils. And so he simply wanted to be there to be with his buddy. But without Curio present, he really had to question his presence in that camp. And so this is partly why in the year 48, when Caelius serves as praetor, that he will try to betray Caesar. And if you want to learn more about that, I recommend my video on Caelius. In any event, we can see that most likely, had Curio managed to survive, he would have been among the assassins on the Ides of March. He had no love for Caesar. He thought Caesar was a cancer to the Republic. But again, I believe that Curio decided Pompey was the greater threat, and so he would work with Caesar to get rid of Pompey, and then in turn get rid of Caesar. It's also possible that as he started to command troops, maybe Curio kind of got a feel for the military life and started to think, maybe I could become a military adventurer. I seem to have a knack for all this. Speaking of that, let's now move into the second part of the video where we talk about Curio's military career, which will be brief, highly controversial, and incredibly action-packed and exciting. The awkward show of friendship in camp didn't have to last too long, as Caesar was on the move and he determined that Curio needed to prove himself in the field. Caesar marched south along the east coast of Italy and eventually moved inland to Corfinium. Here, Domitius Ahenobarbus, one of the real stalwarts of the war party, was eager to make a stand with his fresh recruits. Domitius was very much opposed to Pompey's strategy of withdrawing from Italy altogether, and he thought that if he could get himself in sufficient trouble here, he would force Pompey to march north and fight a general engagement. And that strategy, if indeed that was his intention, was not altogether crazy. After all, although Domitius's troops were far less experienced, if they had the advantage of fortifications, perhaps they might stand a chance. But they looked out at the veterans arrayed against them, and these men decided that this battle was not happening. So they informed Domitius that they were not willing to fight, and he was forced to surrender. As for Curio's role here, he was simply in charge of one of the two camps, and he had command of either the 8th or 13th Legion. This was not much of a battle, but it did give Curio a bit of a refresher course in military affairs, and it was also good to get a victory under his belt, even if it was an anticlimactic one. That being said, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the victory, because not only did Caesar manage to take a city without a fight, but he also picked up 2 legions, as all the men who surrendered swore an oath and came to serve Caesar. He also picked up a fair amount of money, as he forced the 6 senators he captured to pay bribes. And it was also a nice propaganda victory, not to mention that it largely discredited Domitius Ahenobarbus and also created tension between different members of the war party, since Domitius Ahenobarbus had disobeyed direct orders from Pompey. As far as the units that Curio would take with him later, it's pretty clear that neither the 8th nor the 13th Legion was with him in Africa when he needed them the most. But it actually is possible that one of these formations, or perhaps even both, were under his command overall. However, as we'll see, at least one of the units that he picked up here, one of the units that surrendered to Caesar, did seem to go with Curio to Africa. And yet, despite the fact that there were some men in the ranks who were clearly not Caesarian in sentiment, as we'll see, these freshly raised units were apparently relatively well trained by Domitius Ahenobarbus, because they would fight pretty well under Curio later. Although their hopes of winning a civil war against Caesar were largely dependent upon the generalship of Pompey, a number of his chief supporters were not really all that willing to follow orders. Sure, Pompey was one of the greatest generals in Roman history, but was he really that special? So a number of these men were sent out to the provinces to raise troops, and in many cases they took it upon themselves to do what they thought was best and ignore the grand scheme. One example we'll get to in a minute is Aetius Varus, who actually went to Africa and told the legal Pompeian governor that his services were no longer needed because he, Aetius Varus, would be governor instead. One person who surprisingly did follow instructions and work for the greater good of the team was Cato the Younger, a man who was known as the obstructionist-in-chief. But yet in this case he would follow Pompey's instructions. Pompey's general strategy was to dispatch senators to various points outside of Caesar's control to raise troops and secure the resources of those areas for the Pompeian cause. One area that was of particular importance was South Italy and Sicily, and that area Pompey entrusted to Cato the Younger, a former praetor who was a man of great energy and some ability. Because of the importance of anything in Italy or Sicily, Caesar knew that securing that area was of the utmost significance. And so when he entrusted Curio with that task and also gave him a pro-praetorship to boot, this is a sign that Caesar saw something in Curio and thought that he was a reliable and capable instrument of policy. And so Caesar sent Curio down not only to take South Italy and Sicily, but told him to then cross to Africa and secure that as well. The hope was that Curio would largely blitz Italy and Sicily, and then he would have to fight a little bit for Africa. For this operation, Curio was entrusted with 4 legions in total, but only 2 of them were available from the outset. As for Curio, he would move very quickly and energetically in order to secure his objectives. And when it came to the battle of men who were named the Younger, Curio would get the edge over Cato. Before Cato could really raise troops, Curio occupied the cities of South Italy and then crossed into Sicily. And Cato was not really able to reply. In fact, much like with Domitius Ahenobarbus, any troops he raised ended up being Caesar's, although it appears that Cato's formations were not even ready to pretend to take the field yet. So, once again, this was a great victory for Caesar, and the architect of that victory in this instance was Curio all by himself. So he had gained a fairly significant amount of land for no price. Once again, he's not exactly a proven military leader, but he is buoyed up by a couple of victories, one of which he actually was in charge of. So things are off to a great start, and now Curio has 4 legions, he's in Sicily, and he is thinking about how to take control of Africa, and hopefully do so by the end of the summer. Like all of the other Caesarian generals, Curio's morale was sky high. Not only had he partaken in the successful overrun of Italy, but he had even conducted the overrunning of Sicily and hadn't encountered any major obstacles. His men, while the units under him directly were not terribly experienced, had high morale, and they certainly were better trained and organized than the Pompeians of Africa. And so looking across the Mediterranean at Africa, Curio fully expected an easy win. He also knew that the Pompeians not only were dispirited after news of repeated setbacks, but also that they had some command confusion. After all, their previous Pompeian governor had been simply ousted by Publius Aetius Varus, the previous governor, who had just come home and taken over. So Curio anticipated that they would be demoralized. They also were few in number and not trained. So he was not really worried about the Pompeians. The real threat were the Numidians under King Juba. And the reason why they were the real problem is because Juba was not only a longtime ally to Pompey, but also a personal enemy to Curio. And the reason for that, as we mentioned earlier, is that Curio actually proposed annexing the kingdom of Numidia, a position that no king of Numidia could possibly countenance. So, maybe Curio was thinking, if I go in and beat Audius swiftly enough, the Numidians will be intimidated and sue for peace. It's also equally plausible that he wanted to finish off the Pompeians and then conduct an independent war against the Numidians. After all, he could then justify that to Caesar as being a part of the Civil War, while then re-characterizing the war later as an independent campaign for the glory of Rome that just happened to coincide with a Roman Civil War, a conflict in which he really didn't bloody his hands much, since all he did was just drive out some generals who were hapless and had men who wouldn't fight. In any event, Curio decided that the best strategy was to strike swiftly. Unfortunately, he only had enough shipping for 2 of his 4 legions, but again, because speed was more important than overwhelming force, he thought that this was a reasonable risk, and so he had 2 legions embark, and he began the journey across the Mediterranean to Africa. As he embarked upon the rather short journey across the water to Africa, Curio the Younger was happy to find that the gods and odds were still on his side. His quaestor Marcius Rufus was leading an escort squadron of warships when they spotted a force coming out to challenge them. This was not really something that they thought was a serious threat, as naval interceptions were pretty difficult to pull off in the ancient world, and yet that's exactly what had happened. Lucius Caesar the Younger, an eccentric in the bad way cousin of Julius Caesar, had patched up 10 warships and formed a little flotilla, and somehow he had stumbled upon their invasion fleet. However, Lucius Caesar was not a man with a whole lot of physical courage, so when he saw this fleet of real warships that were built in that decade coming at them, he and his men decided to run away. And so they embarrassed themselves, ran away, threw their ships on the beach, and fled on foot. So Marcius was then able to haul those ships away. So it was an easy victory. It boosted morale for Curio even more, and also embarrassed the Pompeians that much the more. So what should have been at least a speed bump for Curio ended up instead being a victory. As if that weren't bad enough, this now gave Curio full confidence that he held naval superiority, as there were no more Pompeian ships in the area at all to worry about, and so Marcius's small squadron could move about freely. He was able to then move to the harbor at Utica to scout out the harbor and start threatening the merchant ships, while Curio was then able to land and march 2 days overland to the river Bagradas. From there, of course, he was able to then advance on Utica. He started encountering both Numidians and Pompeians within a couple days. And they did not really fight united, so had they combined their forces early, they might have made a major challenge to Curio. But as it was, they wanted to fight him in pitched infantry battles on a small scale, which suited his small army. So he was able to bloody the nose of Juba's forces in the area, and then he began to invest the city of Utica, where Varus had his whole force set up. So far, things were going pretty poorly for the Pompeians and perfectly for Curio. Probably the pinnacle of Curio's campaign was that when he entered the harbor on one of Marcius's ships, he addressed the captains of the 200 merchant ships, and he persuaded them to all defect to the Caesarian cause. He told them that the Pompeians were hopelessly disorganized, that Audius Varus was by no means capable of leading them to victory, and probably promised them some rewards. And so all 200 ships decided that they were going to change their colors. This also meant that all these ships were going to offer up their supplies to him. So apparently he had not really sailed out with sufficient provisions because he had been so focused on speed. And now he had made good that shortage. So far, he was conducting this campaign just as brilliantly and haphazardly as Caesar would have. So this was going great. The failures of planning were so far not impeding him in the slightest. When Curio informed his two legions that he had not only secured the harbor, but the 200 ships in it without firing a shot, they were exultant, and they hailed him as imperator. Perhaps it wasn't the traditional way that most generals get hailed for their abilities, but there was no denying that Curio had pulled off something very impressive. He would now win a second victory. The coordination between the Numidians and Pompeians was non-existent throughout this campaign, as we'll see. Juba decided to advance and attack by himself without consulting Aetius Varus, who was nearby at Utica. And he waited until Curio was entrenching because he thought he'd find the Romans napping. However, the Romans were accustomed to that kind of a battle, and so the Romans were able to win easily. Curio's men not only put the cavalry to flight, but then came upon the Numidians so fiercely that the cavalry had to actually flee and leave the infantry to the tender mercy of Curio's legionaries. This means that the Numidian army, so far as Curio knew, was knocked out. They still had their mounted arm, but their infantry had been slaughtered, so they would need to go back and recruit more men to be effective. Not to mention that the king would be chastened and perhaps would be willing to come to the negotiating table. Without a doubt, this was the pinnacle of Curio's military career. He didn't know it yet, but this was the equal of when he got the Senate to vote overwhelmingly in favor of his peace proposal. As the action began to slow down, and he slowly advanced on Utica, where the Pompeian force was, a rift within his camp would start to appear. This would be a pretty bad warning sign, as a number of men in his unit, who had been raised, of course, originally to fight for Pompey, turned out to be Pompeian loyalists. One of them was actually a former quaestor, so someone who was a senator, and he left their camp, went up to the walls of Utica, and then taunted the two legions under Curio, urging his former comrades to come join up. So this was a problem, and Curio's officers were worried. So their understanding of this is that the longer they waited, the worse this would get. So they either needed to staunch the bleeding by attacking immediately before this force could be innervated anymore, or they needed to fall back to Castra Cornelia and bring in those other two legions from Sicily. Curio, however, said, "Boys, we got this. These are just a few malefactors. They do not represent the opinions of the majority of the men here, and we can press forward and be victorious. We've already won every battle we fought. They are far more dispirited than we are, and we can carry the day." So he gave a speech to his men after convincing his officers, and the men cheerfully endorsed finishing the campaign right here and now. And so once again, Curio was still riding high. Sure, difficulties were starting to mount, but why would he have any doubts? So far, he had simply destroyed every obstacle in his path, and surely this would continue indefinitely. The morning after the speech, Curio decided to challenge Aetius Varus to a field battle in the hopes that he would accept. And much to Curio's delight, that's exactly what happened. He had his own reasons, but Aetius Varus also felt like an immediate victory would be quite helpful to him. He probably was not ready for a siege. If we think about it, Aetius Varus had just lost his harbor and all of his supply ships. So he knew that overall the strategic picture was dark. He also had failed to coordinate at all with the Numidians and probably didn't really know what the king intended. Eventually he would get in contact with him, but the two men would never really see eye to eye or coordinate on any level. There's also reason to believe, and we'll get into this later, that the king of Numidia by no means took Aetius Varus seriously. So, Aetius Varus wanted to win this on his own, and he didn't want to be trapped in Utica. So it was in the interest of both generals, therefore, to fight this battle. The battlefield was a weird one, though, because when the two armies met each other, they found that they were separated by a large natural depression. So any army that attacked would have to go down a steep bank and then up another, and directly into the face of the enemy. Any idiot should have realized that being the attacking force would be a major disadvantage. And so Aetius Varus, had he been a better general, would have waited and made Curio go first, since Curio had the higher quality force. Instead, Aetius Varus decided that the gods were with him, and so he struck first, sending his light troops ahead and then following up with his heavy legionaries. But predictably, as they tried to come up the slope, Curio's men threw their javelins in and were able to wreak havoc. Then immediately, upon the advice of one of his legates, Gaius Caninius Rebilus, a later suffect consul, Curio decided to charge, and so his men now poured into the ditch and were not only able to inflict more casualties on the Pompeians, but then once they reached the top of the next bank, the enemy were unable to rally. Many of them were cut down, and the rest were routed and had to take refuge in Utica. So this was a glorious victory. However, for Curio, he was covered in even more glory, because during the battle, he himself had gotten into a very vicious battle with an enemy soldier from East Italy named Fabius, someone who would be a descendant of the Samnites. And this man Fabius had nearly killed Curio, who had to be saved by some of the men around him. So for Curio, this was proof of his personal valor, since he had put it all on the line and nearly lost his life. Again, so far, things were going great, and this great risk of crossing this intimidating ditch had paid off. So surely, the gods were still with Curio the Younger. The Battle of Utica was a pretty impressive victory for Curio. Despite the small scale of the fight, he had succeeded in killing 600 of Aetius's men and wounding another 1,000. The exact size of Aetius's force is unclear, but certainly they were now quite hobbled and incapable of offense. They also were now bottled up in Utica itself and invested tightly, most likely without any substantial provisions. Unfortunately, Curio was not able to then storm the city on the heels of his victory. His men had no assault gear, so there weren't even ladders with which they could climb the walls. Because of that, he had no choice but to entrench and try to starve out the city. He didn't think it would take very long. After all, Aetius Varus was thoroughly embarrassed. His ally, the new Numidian king, had been defeated, and so obviously the city would surrender, the people would refuse to continue to endure hardship, and it would all be over soon. And in fact, Aetius Varus did face long odds. The population of the city had no wish to be involved in a losing cause, and if not for timely messengers from Juba, his men would have lost all hope. But as it was, they knew the Numidians were coming back with another army, and so they continued to man the walls and tried to tend to their wounds. In the meantime, these reports also reached the camp of Curio, but he didn't take them seriously. After all, there's no way Juba could be back after he had so thoroughly trounced him so recently. Accordingly, since he didn't believe the rumors, Curio persisted in his siege and continued to wait for Aetius Varus to wave the white flag. Although he was very slow to accept the reports of an approaching Numidian relief force, Curio eventually accepted reality when that force was only 25 miles away. That was about a day's march distant, and he didn't want to be trapped between a hostile garrison and a large force that was more mobile than his own. And so he decided that discretion was the better half of valor. He retreated to his beachhead at Castra Cornelia where his ships were. And thus, Aetius was saved. Sure, they had had the minimum of coordination, but ultimately the Pompeians and Numidians together had finally achieved something. By the way, after this point, Aetius Varus will play no further role in the campaign whatsoever. His force was, for all practical intents and purposes, still knocked out after the Battle of Utica. From now on, it would be Curio and his good friend King Juba. As for Castra Cornelia, the camp of the Cornelii, this was the site of Scipio's initial landing in Africa in 203 during the Second Punic War. And this site, according to Caesar, was a place that was naturally strong, had good routes to Sicily by sea. This is also at a time, of course, as we mentioned, when Curio had complete naval dominance. There were no ships of the enemy at all, so he was able to resupply himself at will. He also was able to send his transports back to Sicily to gather his other 2 legions. So the idea was, hopefully the Numidians would try to attack his camp, which would be a fool's errand, and then his other 2 legions would arrive, and then they could pursue and win another great victory. They could either attack Utica or even Carthage. Who knew? But it was clear to Curio that glory was in his future. However, he remembered what Alexander the Great had once said, that fortune favors the bold. And when opportunity knocked, he was determined to answer. So while his initial plan was to await for his reinforcements and double his army, he then learned from Numidian deserters that, in fact, the Numidian army that was approaching was not the main force under Juba, but rather just part of the army under his general Suburra. Juba was actually dealing with more important matters off in Leptis, and he was leaving the relief of Utica to Suburra. And so Curio decided that he needed to be more like Caesar. He needed to strike the enemy while they were divided and take advantage of this opportunity. And so he decided it was time to act like Caesar would and leave the safety of Castra Cornelia. Based on the reports that he had received from the Numidian deserters, Curio was firmly convinced that he was only facing Suburra's vanguard and that Juba's main army was elsewhere. Any battle he fought would be a one-on-one with no real possibility of outside interference. His men, if they had the initiative, could win a quick and decisive little victory that would enable him to retain the strategic initiative. And so Curio began marching at night and arrived at the camp at dawn. For this operation, he took 15 of his 20 cohorts, leaving 5 under Marcius Rufus in camp. This was to be a lightning strike. His men were able to overrun the unfortified camp almost immediately, and they began to fall into looting it. Then they reformed and tried to fight the Numidians again once it was clear that Suburra and his men outside the camp had reformed and were not willing to give up so easily. This was all fine and well. One thing that Curio didn't really notice, though, is that some of the men who came up to reinforce Suburra were clearly from elsewhere. In fact, these men were not only not in that camp they'd just overrun, but they arrived on the scene a little later, and that's because Juba was only actually 6 miles away from Suburra, and he had heard word of the event and sent up his mercenary Spanish and Gallic horse, 2,000 strong, to shore up Suburra. So Suburra was now in a holding pattern near the Romans, and neither side was fully engaged. Curio thought this meant that Suburra was too proud to admit defeat, but also too timid to engage. So he believed that as the day wore on, eventually he would engage and defeat the Numidians and add to the glory of this little lightning strike. But this was not going to go the way he thought it would. Alexander the Great's famous dictum that fortune favors the bold should really be amended to say, fortune favors the bold and prepared. Alexander was famously always prepared, and that's why he could be bold. Curio only had the boldness, but had not really learned how to plan. And he found himself in a bad spot. Here, he was now 16 miles away from his camp. His men had marched all through the night without much sleep. They were now fighting in the heat of North Africa. It was August. And they only had 200 cavalry. So of the 500 horsemen he had brought with him to Africa, for whatever reason, Curio had only brought 40% of them to this particular battle. In the meantime, he was fighting a horse-centered army. The Numidians were known as the best light cavalry of the ancient world. And he was trying to do so while at a significant disadvantage in mobility and with infantry who were already tired. This was already bad enough, even without Juba being there. But now it was about to get far, far worse. When Suburra did finally engage, the Romans, despite being tired, fought on bravely. After all, they had been winning so far, and they had been winning all campaign. But they were too tired to face these lighter, faster opponents and rout them again. So the Numidians continued to wear them down and to cut them down with javelins. And they couldn't help but notice, the Romans, that the Numidians kept getting more and more numerous. until finally it became apparent that actually Juba was close at hand. And then he was there, and now they were encircled. According to Caesar's writing, which is incidentally the only real source we have for this entire campaign, Curio was so ashamed at his conduct that he resolved to die on the battlefield rather than face Caesar. I assume that's sarcasm. I doubt that Curio's reason for wanting to die here was that he was ashamed of having failed Caesar, a man he had never liked. It was probably more that he was just ashamed in general. After all, this was his own doing. This was his hubris. This was his attempt to be Caesar, coming down crashing hard. And so, when his officers put together a breakout attempt, they offered Curio a spot, and he declined. He said, "I will die with the unfortunate." So he did go out like a man, and he did take responsibility for his decisions. Some men did cut their way out, and Curio was among those who perished. And so, this ends the life and military career of a man I can only think of as the Roman equivalent of Major General Charles Townshend of the British Empire, who famously also had a brilliant series of successes capped off by a total catastrophe in Mesopotamia fighting the Ottomans during World War I. By the way, Curio's woes did not end with his death. After his legion and a half was destroyed at the Bagradas, back at camp at Castra Cornelia, the other 5 cohorts learned of the fate of their comrades and panicked. They then tried to swim out to the remaining ships and actually swamped some of them in the harbor. So when the Numidians rode up to their camp to lay siege, they found the Romans were completely and totally demoralized, unwilling and unable to fight, and that they had actually destroyed a number of their own ships. The other ships, seeing what was happening to the ships closer to the beach, had actually left because they didn't want to be mobbed and destroyed by these desperate, panicked men. Juba duly demanded and accepted the surrender of these men and then slaughtered them. By the way, this would mean that later on, when Caesar conquered Africa, that Juba would commit suicide. After all, there was no chance of receiving Caesar's clemency after such a massacre. And even though he had nothing to do with it, Aetius Varus was also condemned by Caesar for his role in this campaign. So Aetius Varus was largely forced to also take his own life because he was just here, present in the theater of operations at the time. One wonders what might have happened if Curio had put just a little more planning into this operation, because clearly both of the opponents he faced were very beatable and not terribly competent. And yet, here he would fall short because he decided to get a little too greedy with his little lightning strike against General Sabura. Today, scholars are more cognizant than ever that Curio the Younger is not only a great representation of the last generation of the Republic, but that he was also a major player in the events of 49 and the outbreak of the Civil War. So study of Curio has been on the rise. It's also interesting that apparently someone at Ohio State decided to commission an AI image of Curio or commission a sketch, and the person or AI that they asked to create this thing thought that they asked for Brian Koberger with the Roman haircut. So here you are. Thank you to OSU for producing that and putting it on their webpage. At any rate, Curio is now usually seen as somewhat typical of his generation, although I would argue that he was unusual in the sense that he was clearly highly capable, and there's also no evidence that he stuck with the partying lifestyle the way that Antony did, so I don't know if he's necessarily the best representative of that aspect of that generation. However, he probably does represent the political flexibility of that generation, and also their disgust with what the generation before them had wrought. His career as a whole does very well illuminate, as Loomis Loggy says, the multidimensional reality of late Republican politics, i.e. that the simple divide between the populares and the optimates, while it does explain some things, is oversimplified, and there were a number of people who did not really fit in with that very well. clearly Curio is one of the people who does not fit that mold at all. He both was the heir of Clodius, who was a clear popularis, while also not really deviating from the basic assumptions of the Boni, the men he'd been raised with. Curio's peace proposal also showed a great deal of political insight from him. And it also shows that the vast majority of the Senate, despite the fact that most of them would partake in the war on one side or the other, didn't want the war to happen in the first place. So Curio was very much the guy who took the public's temperature and came up with a proposal that best expressed what the Senate actually wanted. Of course, that didn't become law, but it is proof, if proof were needed, that civil war was not the desired outcome for the vast majority of senators. Again, there is the famous tradition that Curio went over to Caesar's side due to bribery, but I've argued against that, and most recent scholarship has also called that into question at a minimum or rejected it outright. My personal theory is that he was simply disgusted by the way that he had been treated when he tried to put forward a compromise measure, and that this drove him into Caesar's arms despite the fact that he personally still despised Caesar as much as ever. So, effectively, Curio never stopped hating Caesar, but he found someone in Pompey who he hated even more. Or maybe his real bugbear was someone like Lentulus Crus or Metellus Scipio or one of Pompey's hangers-on, the people he dealt with more directly when he was trying to put forward his peace proposal. Curio was clearly a very talented man, but he did have his flaws. He could probably be prideful. It appears that it was a personal reason why he decided to jump over to Caesar's camp. He also could be impulsive, as we saw in his campaign in Africa. However, before he was surrounded and destroyed, he did show quite a bit of skill, and he won multiple skirmishes prior to that defeat. Curio knew how to inspire men in the field, just like he could when he was a speaker on the rostrum, and he was a man who had greatness within him. It just never quite got to blossom. So it's my belief that had he survived the African campaign, especially if he had managed to win in the end, that he would have gone on to be one of the monumental figures of his era, assuming that someone didn't assassinate him. But as it stands, right now, he's represented mostly by Brian Koberger sketches, as we struggle to figure out what is a better way to represent this important and complex figure from the late Republic. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will bring you more Romans of renown as we move forward.